"Look, we're not running a heritage flight today, ma'am." That was what he said, not quietly, not as an aside meant for her ears only. He said it in front of the duty crew, in front of the operations desk watchstanders, in front of the yeoman who had paused mid-keystroke to look up, and in front of the intelligence officer who had walked in for a weather brief and now stood with his coffee going cold. Captain Reeves said it the way a man says something he wants remembered, with the particular bright edge of a man who has learned that humiliation travels faster than praise in a closed building, and who has decided to use that fact. She did not move. She stood at the desk, with both hands resting lightly on the counter, her posture easy and undefended, and she looked at him the way a person looks at a weather display they have consulted 10,000 times, with a calm, particular attention that contains no emotion at all. Her reading glasses were folded in her left hand. Her hair was pinned back with a single gray clip. The contractor badge on the lanyard around her neck showed a photo of a face perhaps 10 years younger, which is to say, a face that was already quiet, already patient, already the kind of face that made men like Captain Reeve nervous without knowing why. She had asked a simple question. She had asked whether the KC-135 slotted for the tanker escort mission still had an assigned crew. He had laughed. Not the laugh of a man genuinely amused. The laugh of a man establishing a social fact, which is to say, establishing a hierarchy, establishing the terms of an interaction so that everyone watching would understand that he held the authority in the room and that she, whoever she was, did not. Heritage flight, that was the word he had chosen. A heritage flight, as in a ceremonial excursion, as in the kind of thing arranged for elderly veterans on Veterans Day, a gentle turn around the pattern at low altitude with a safety pilot in the right seat and a camera crew on the ramp, the kind of thing that gets a write-up in the base newspaper and a handshake from the wing public affairs officer. He had compared what she was offering to that. He had done it in a room full of people who all understood exactly what he meant. The yeoman looked back at her keyboard. The intelligence officer took a sip of coffee that was no longer warm. The watchstander at the far end of the desk became very interested in his screen. Captain Reeve was still smiling. She was still looking at him. She said quietly that she understood, and she folded her reading glasses into the breast pocket of her jacket, and she walked out into the corridor. She did not slam the door. She did not stop walking to look back. She went to a chair in the corridor outside the operations center, a row of gray plastic chairs bolted to the wall, the way all military corridor chairs are bolted to the wall, the way things that must endure heavy use and institutional indifference are bolted everywhere in buildings like this. And she sat down, and she folded her hands in her lap, and she waited. This is a story about what she was waiting for, and before this night is done, you will understand exactly what that was. The date was the 14th of July, 2026. The time was 11 minutes past 2 in the afternoon, local. The location was Al Udeid Air Base, Qatar, the central logistics hub of United States Air Force's Central Command, and one of the busiest military airfields on the planet. Outside the reinforced windows of the operations center, the tarmac shimmered in heat that registered 108 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade. The Gulf burned white at the horizon. The Strait of Hormuz was 90 minutes to the southeast by air, and the strait was not quiet. The ceasefire that had ended 8 months of careful diplomatic maneuvering had collapsed 4 days earlier. Not in a single dramatic announcement, but in the way such things always collapse, in small pieces, in a border incident here and a radar contact there, in a patrol boat that did not respond to radio calls, in a communique that arrived 12 hours after its stated deadline and said nothing useful, in a series of events that taken individually might have been navigated but taken together added up to the particular silence that precedes something loud. The strait was reporting Iranian fast boat swarms at the eastern choke point. Electronic emissions consistent with fire control radar activation had been logged twice in the past 18 hours. 3 maritime patrol aircraft had been redirected from their standard tracks. Fifth Fleet needed eyes in the corridor. Fifth Fleet needed fighters on the escort track. And Fifth Fleet's fighters needed fuel. The KC-135 was the answer to that last problem. It was always the KC-135 that was the answer to that last problem. For 70 years, the aircraft had been threading the sky above contested water, extending reach, enabling operations that could not happen without it. A flying fuel station that was unglamorous and absolutely indispensable. The kind of capability that never appears on the poster and without which the poster would be blank. The Stratotanker. Old, reliable, difficult to love, and necessary in the way that breathing is necessary. Without fanfare, without negotiation, without any possibility of replacement. The specific aircraft assigned to the mission, tail number 61-0275, had been in service since the Kennedy administration. It had been refurbished, upgraded, rewired, and re-engined so many times that almost nothing original remained, which meant almost nothing of it was truly old, which meant it was the kind of machine that accumulates identity rather than age. The crew scheduled to fly it was young. Not inexperienced in the conventional sense, they were current and qualified and signed off on every box the checklist required them to be signed off on, but young in the sense that the corridor they were about to enter was not a concept to them. It was still an abstraction. They had studied it in training. They had reviewed the threat assessments. They had looked at the maps and the altitude profiles and the radio frequencies. But the corridor itself, the specific weight of it, the darkness of the Gulf at altitude, the way the radar returns shifted when you were low and slow and something painted you from the shore, all of that was still theory. The woman in the corridor had flown it 47 times. Her name was Colonel Elaine Marsh. She was 56 years old. She had retired from active duty 7 years prior after a career that spanned 3 decades, 2 wars, and more miles of sky than most pilots accumulate in 2 lifetimes. She was currently contracted to the wing as a technical advisor on tanker integration planning, which is the kind of position that involves a great deal of sitting in meetings with a legal pad and a coffee and reviewing documents that will not be released for public consumption for another 40 years. It was the kind of position that a person accepts when they have spent 30 years doing the actual work and have reached the age at which the actual work will no longer have them, and when they are not yet ready to stop entirely. She was not in the operations center because someone had sent for her. She was there because she had read the mission board that morning and had done the arithmetic, and the arithmetic had produced a number that concerned her, and she had walked down the corridor to say so. She had not expected to be laughed at. She had not expected it either. She had simply gone to ask the question, and the question had been answered in a particular way, and now she was sitting in a gray plastic chair with her hands in her lap, waiting. Captain Reeve had been in command of the operations section for 11 months. He was 38 years old, which is not young by most civilian standards, but which is young enough, in a military context, to have acquired authority before acquiring the full weight of what authority costs. He was technically proficient. His fitness reports were good. His record showed a man who did things correctly, who followed the process, who filled the boxes, who arrived on time and filed the paperwork and never gave his superiors a reason to look at him twice. These are genuine virtues, and they are not to be dismissed. The military runs on them the way an engine runs on oil. Without them, the machine seizes. But there is a particular failure mode that comes with that kind of virtue, which is the failure mode of the man who has learned to be right by following the rules and who has therefore come to believe that the rules contain all possible rightness. Captain Reeve was good at his job in the way that a well-calibrated instrument is good at measuring. He was accurate within his range. Outside his range, the gauge read nothing, and he did not know the range had limits. When the woman with the reading glasses and the contractor badge had appeared at his desk and asked about the KC-135, he had not been cruel in any calculated way. He had not sat down and decided to humiliate her. He had simply looked at her and formed an impression in the half-second that first impressions require, and the impression had produced a category, and the category had produced a response, and the response had emerged already shaped into something public and cutting before he had examined it. The Heritage flight line was not planned. It was the kind of thing that comes out of a man when he is very certain of his category and very uninterested in examining it further. He had already moved on. He had assigned the junior crew. He had filed the mission paperwork. He had his coffee. He was looking at the evening weather forecast and thinking about the refueling track altitude when his desk phone rang, and then he was on a call about airspace deconfliction with the Maritime Patrol Coordination Cell, and then another call about the fighter squadron's fuel state, and then another about the updated threat assessment that had just arrived from the intelligence shop. By the time 3 hours had passed, he had not thought about the woman in the corridor at all. The woman in the corridor had thought about a great many things. She thought about the eastern choke point and the fast boat profiles she had studied in the mission brief she had read that morning, which was the same brief Captain Reeve had read, but which she had read with the particular understanding of someone who had been at that choke point in the dark, who had run that track with fighters calling their fuel states over the radio in voices that were deliberately calm in the way that voices are deliberately calm when the person using them is not entirely calm, who had sat in the left seat of a very large, very slow, very non-maneuverable aircraft at 400 feet over black water while radar painted the bottom of the wings. She thought about the altitude profile for the night track. She thought about the radio procedures and the order in which the fighters would call for their fuel and the sequence of contacts the tanker crew would need to maintain with the escort coordination cell. She thought about the weather system that was building to the north and what it would do to the tanker's ceiling over the secondary refueling point. She thought about these things with the calm, methodical precision of someone who has stopped needing to think hard about them, someone for whom this kind of planning occupies the same cognitive register as driving a familiar road, automatic and effortless, and leaving the conscious mind free to notice the things that a less experienced mind would miss. She was sitting in the corridor doing this when the radio crackle in the operations center changed character. She did not need to hear the words to know what had happened. She had been in enough operations centers on enough nights to know what a mission abort sounds like through 2 inches of wall. The particular quality of the silence that replaces the normal background communication chatter, followed by the particular quality of the voices that follow, clipped and direct and without the rhythmic ease of routine traffic, told her before she heard the first recognizable phrase. The junior crew had aborted. She did not stand up immediately, she waited. She listened to the quality of the activity inside the room, tracking the arc of it, following the shape of the problem as it developed, timing her re-entry. In 6 minutes she knew what she needed to know, and she stood up, and she smoothed the front of her jacket, and she put her reading glasses on, and she walked back to the operations desk. Captain Reeve was on the phone. He looked up when she came in. He did not look pleased to see her. He held up one finger, the wait a moment finger, and he finished his call, and he set the handset down, and he looked at her with the expression of a man who has just spent 3 hours making decisions and is now being confronted by a complication he thought he had already handled. She did not say anything. She set her hands on the counter in exactly the same position they had been in 3 hours earlier. She reached into the breast pocket of her jacket, and she removed a card. It was laminated, worn at the corners, the kind of card that has been carried for years. She set it on the counter and slid it across to him with 2 fingers, the way you set down something you want someone to look at without making a production of it. He looked at it. The card was a flight hours summary card, the kind maintained by military pilots as a personal record, a compressed history of a career in numbers and type designations. The format was standard, and the numbers were not. 3,214 hours in type. KC-135 Stratotanker, multiple variant series. 47 combat zone refueling tracks. Hormuz corridor, 2006 through 2009. Night tanking evolutions over open water. Multiple, including 14 under elevated threat conditions. A commendation citation number, followed by the words 5th Fleet Command, signed by Vice Admiral M. Corrigan, 2008. Additional combat zone service, multiple theaters, instructor qualification, evaluator certification, night vision goggle qualification, low-level operations certification, threat environment procedures qualification. She flew this corridor before this desk existed. Captain Reeve read it twice. The second time was slower than the first. He set the card down without saying anything, and he looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them spoke. Then he said he needed to verify through channels. She said of course. She said she would wait, and she went back to the corridor. If stories like this mean something to you, you can help keep them coming on Patreon. The link is right there in the description. The operations center behind her was not quiet for long. The first call went to the wing personnel section, requesting a records pull on contractor credential file, Marsh, Elaine, Colonel, Usaf retired. The records pull took 4 minutes and returned a document that the duty records clerk, a young airman first class who had been in the Air Force for 14 months, printed out and walked down the hall to the operations center himself, rather than transmitting electronically, because he had read the first page and had decided this was the kind of thing that should be hand-delivered. The document was 31 pages long. This was not unusual for a 30-year military career. What was unusual was the density of the pages, the way the entries stacked against each other with very little white space, the way the decorations section extended across 3 pages, the way the remarks sections of the evaluation reports did not use the standard language of military performance reviews, the careful, moderate, qualified language that says a great deal while committing to nothing, but instead used specific declarative sentences of the kind that evaluators reserve for personnel they consider genuinely exceptional and are concerned that future reviewers might underestimate. Captain Reeve read the first 5 pages. Then he picked up the phone and called the wing commander. Colonel Voss was in his quarters. It was 17 minutes past 5 in the afternoon. He had been there for 40 minutes after a full duty day, and he had just poured himself a glass of water and sat down at the small desk he used for personal correspondence when his phone rang and the operations duty officer told him he needed to come to the operations center. He asked why. The duty officer told him. There was a pause on the line. Colonel Voss set down his glass of water. He said he would be there in 8 minutes. He was there in 6. He did not go to the operations desk first. He went to the corridor. She was still in the gray plastic chair. She had taken out a small notebook, the kind with a worn cardboard cover, and she was writing in it with a mechanical pencil, making notes in the tight, abbreviated script of someone accustomed to writing in cockpits. She looked up when he came around the corner, and she started to stand, and he said, "Please, stay seated." And something in the way he said it, not as a courtesy but as a genuine request, made her pause. He sat down in the chair next to her, not the chair across the row, not the chair at the far end, the chair directly adjacent. He was a tall man with close-cut gray hair and the particular economy of movement that comes from having spent a career in the Air Force, from having learned very early that unnecessary motion in confined spaces is an inefficiency and that unnecessary motion in general is a habit that costs more than it gives. He sat down and he held the personnel file, and he did not open it because he had already read enough of it. He said, "Ma'am, I owe you an apology on behalf of this wing." She considered him for a moment. She said the mission was what mattered right now. He said yes. He said he understood that. And he said it again anyway, the apology, because he had been in the Air Force for 32 years, and he knew the difference between the things you say because they are required and the things you say because they are true, and this was the latter. She accepted it in the way she had accepted the original insult, without visible reaction, without theatrical emotion in either direction, with the level, steady attention of someone who has been in enough rooms to know that what matters is not the acknowledgement, but what comes after it. She asked about the mission. He opened the file then, not to read it, but to set it on the chair beside him so that it was present in the conversation, a physical object representing a set of facts they were both now operating from. He asked her to walk him through the track. She walked him through the track. She described the night profile, the altitude, the speed, the sequencing for the fighter contacts, the timing on the first and second offload points, the contingency for the radar activation that had been logged twice in the previous 18 hours, the weather to the north, and what she intended to do about the ceiling over the secondary point, the radio procedures she would follow, and the handoff sequence with the escort coordination cell, the abort criteria she would apply, and when she would apply them, and what she would do if the criteria were met at the worst possible moment in the track, which was over the deepest part of the corridor, the farthest from the recovery base, with fighters on her wing at minimum fuel. She spoke for 9 minutes. She did not use the notebook. She did not use notes of any kind. The wing commander listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I need a co-pilot qualified current in type who can be ready in 2 hours." She said she had been thinking about that. She said the junior co-pilot from the aborted crew, the one who had not been flying as pilot in command, had the right qualifications and the right currency. She said she had looked at his training record that morning, and that she thought, if Colonel Voss agreed, that the experience of flying the track with a crew of this background would be of more value to that officer's development than anything he was likely to encounter in the next 6 months of normal operations. The wing commander looked at her for a moment. Then he said he agreed. He stood up. She stood up. He held out his hand, and she shook it. He said, "You'll have everything you need." Then he walked back around the corner toward the operations center, and she followed him, and they came through the door together, and the room changed when they did. The change was not dramatic. It was the kind of change that happens in a military operations center when a senior commander enters with purpose, a subtle redistribution of attention, a slight straightening of posture, a reorientation of the room's energy toward a new center of gravity. Captain Reeve was at his desk. He saw the wing commander first and started to come to attention, and then he saw who was with him, and his face did something complicated that it did not fully resolve before he had it under control. Colonel Voss did not address him immediately. He went to the mission board and looked at it for a moment, and then he turned and gave 3 direct, specific instructions to the duty officer, and then he turned to Captain Reeve and said, in a voice that was entirely level and entirely without theater, that he would like a word at the end of the duty day. Captain Reeve said, "Yes, sir." The wing commander walked to the far end of the desk and picked up a phone. The room returned to its normal cadence of activity, or something that looked like its normal cadence, and Colonel Elaine Marsh sat down at the mission planning terminal and began pulling up the weather data for the corridor. The duty day did not end for another 6 hours. The mission lifted 2 hours and 14 minutes after the corridor conversation. At the time of liftoff, the air temperature on the ramp was still 103 degrees Fahrenheit. The sun was below the horizon, but the heat was not. The KC-135 rolled out of its parking spot with the particular deliberateness of a very large aircraft that moves at its own pace and does not apologize for it. And the sound of the engines reached the operations center window as a low, sustained frequency that you felt in the chest before you heard it in the ears. Captain Reeve was still at his desk. He watched the aircraft until it turned onto the runway and was occluded by the terminal building. He did not know yet what the night would hold, but he had begun, in the past 2 hours, to develop a more accurate understanding of what he did not know. The KC-135 broke ground at 1941 local and turned southeast, toward the dark, toward the Gulf, toward the corridor. The co-pilot in the right seat was a young captain named Torres. He had been pulled from the crew that aborted, had been given 45 minutes to compose himself and review the mission package, and had appeared at the aircraft with the particular, careful alertness of someone who understands that something significant is happening and who is trying to be equal to it. He had looked at the pilot in the left seat once, at the ramp, before they boarded, and had not said anything, and she had not said anything either. They had completed the walk-around, they had reviewed the checklist, they had completed the run-up, and they had taxied without unnecessary communication. Now, at altitude, crossing the Gulf in the dark, he was watching her fly the way you watch someone do something you have done many times but have not yet done well, with the specific attention of someone trying to understand the difference between what they do and what is actually possible. She flew the aircraft the way she had described flying it in the corridor. Not dramatically, with a kind of settled efficiency that made the large aircraft feel precise, a quiet confidence of input that produced response without excess, that anticipated rather than reacted, that absorbed the particular character of the aircraft, its weight, its inertia, its preferred relationship with the air, and worked with it rather than against it. He had 560 hours in type. He had been taught that the KC-135 was a heavy, demanding aircraft with significant lag between input and response, the kind of aircraft that required constant correction and anticipation. What he was watching was not that. What he was watching was not correction and anticipation. What he was watching was something that looked like agreement. The aircraft and the pilot in a conversation so long established that it had simplified to the point of apparent silence. The first fighter contact came at 22 minutes past 8, local. A pair of F-18s, call sign Warhawk 11 and 12, on the escort track, descending from their cruise altitude to the refueling contact position. The radio call was textbook. The response from the left seat was textbook. The aircraft entered the refueling track on time and on altitude and on airspeed, and the boom operator in the aft station locked on the first contact without the trailing alignment corrections that normally characterized the first contact in this corridor at night, where the visual references were minimal and the aircraft's position over the black water was a matter of instruments and habit. The boom operator, a staff sergeant named Delray who had been flying tankers for 9 years, noted the alignment in his log and did not say anything. Some things you note without saying. Some things you file in the particular memory that tells you later how to answer when someone asks you what you have seen over the years that you would want them to know. The first offload was complete. At 41 minutes past 8, the fighters climbed. The tanker held the track. 14 minutes of dead time, standard, while the escort coordination cell confirmed the second element's fuel state and cleared the secondary contact. At 9:03, the radar activation warning sounded. Not an alarm, not a klaxon, a tone, a specific tone that every crew member on the aircraft had heard in training and that most of them had heard in training only. It indicated an electronic emission from the surface, to the south, below them, of a character consistent with fire control radar. Not a targeting solution, not a launch indication, an emission. The co-pilot, Torres, felt his hands move toward the controls before he had consciously decided to move them. He caught the motion. He stopped it. He looked left. She was already on the radio. Her voice in the radio call was the same voice she had used at the desk that afternoon, and in the corridor, and in the weather brief with the wing commander. The same voice. Steady, informational, professionally uninflected. She was reporting the emission. She was providing her position. She was providing her altitude. She was requesting fighter positioning information. She was calculating the track adjustment for the secondary contact point to reduce their exposure window while maintaining the ability to complete the offload. She was doing several things simultaneously, in sequence, in the correct order, with the efficiency of someone who has done this before and who knows what the correct order is, because she has tested it. The emission lasted 18 seconds. Then it stopped. The secondary fighter element checked in 11 minutes later. The second offload was completed on time. The fighters turned for their return heading. Fuel complete. Escort track satisfied. The KC-135 climbed to its return altitude and turned northwest, toward the base, toward the heat and the lights and the operations center where Captain Reeve was sitting at his desk with his end-of-day debrief with the wing commander still ahead of him. The aircraft touched down at 11:23, local. The ramp temperature had dropped to 91 degrees. The taxi to the parking spot took 7 minutes. The engines spooled down in the order specified by the checklist, in the time specified by the checklist. And then the cockpit was quiet, except for the cooling systems and the sound of 2 people completing the post-flight documentation. Torres filled out his portion of the form. He set down his pen. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "Ma'am, I have a question, and I don't know if it's appropriate." She said to ask it. He said, "The radar activation. You were already on the radio before the tone finished." "How did you know?" She considered this for a moment. Then she said she didn't know. She said she had flown this track on a night when the emission had preceded a fast boat surge by 11 minutes, and that her hands had learned something from that night that her mind didn't always have access to in the ordinary way. She said that was the best answer she had. Torres sat with that for a moment. He said, "I want to fly this track again." She said that was the correct response. Then they gathered their materials and opened the cockpit door and walked down the crew entry ladder to the ramp, into the 91-degree night, into the smell of JP-8 and hot concrete and the particular metallic sweetness of a very large aircraft that has been working for hours and is now resting. The debrief was held in a conference room off the main operations hallway. It was 12 minutes past midnight when it convened. Present were Colonel Voss, the wing commander, the escort fighter squadron commander, the intelligence officer who had been in the operations center that afternoon with his cold coffee, the boom operator Del Rey, Captain Torres, and Colonel Marsh. Captain Reeve was not present. He was in the wing commander's office, which he had been told to report to at the end of the duty day, and the wing commander's aide had informed him that the wing commander would be with him following the mission debrief. The debrief proceeded in the standard order. The intel officer went first with the threat environment summary. The escort fighter lead, a lieutenant colonel who had been flying F-18s for 14 years, gave his element's account of the track. The boom operator gave his. Torres gave his. Each report was factual, organized, and concise. Then they looked at Colonel Marsh. She had her notebook open. She completed a sentence in it, and then she looked up. She gave her account of the track in the same way she gave every account, organized, factual, specific, with the particular precision of someone who believes that clarity is a form of respect for the people in the room. She described the track profile, the two fighter contacts, the offload sequencing, the radar emission event, her response to it, and the recovery. She noted one area where the radio procedure with the escort coordination cell had been slow and recommended a minor adjustment to the pre-flight coordination sequence for future missions. She noted that Captain Torres had performed correctly at every decision point and that his co-pilot judgment during the emission event had been what she would have expected from an officer with twice his experience. Torres looked at the table. She closed her notebook. Colonel Voss had been listening with the particular focused patience that characterized his leadership in rooms like this. He did not speak immediately when she finished. He sat with the last words for a moment, as if ensuring they had settled properly. Then he looked at her. He said, "Ma'am," a single word, spoken in the particular way that a word becomes something more than a word in a quiet room, the way a note held at the right pitch, at the right moment, in a piece of music, becomes something the musicians did not compose and the composer did not write. It held in it the acknowledgement of the afternoon, and the apology already made, and the 6 hours between the corridor and this room, and the track over the black water, and the 18 seconds of radar tone, and everything Torres had tried to describe in the cockpit afterward. It held all of that, and it was precise, and it was enough. She received it the way she received everything, steadily, without performance. She said, "Thank you for putting me on the mission." The debrief concluded at 12:41. People gathered their materials and stood and moved toward the door in the low-energy way of people who have been on duty for a very long time and are now genuinely at the end of it. The wing commander remained seated. He waited until the room had mostly emptied. Then he stood and walked with Colonel Marsh to the door, and at the door he said, quietly, that he intended to request her for a contract extension, if she was willing. He said the wing needed institutional memory of the corridor, and that he was not aware of another resource that contained it in this form. She said she would think about it. He said, of course. She walked out into the hallway. At the far end of the hallway, through the glass door of the wing commander's office, she could see Captain Reeves sitting in a chair. He was facing forward. His back was straight. He was waiting. She did not look at him for more than a moment. She was already thinking about the weather system to the north and what it would do to the return routing over the next 72 hours. She turned the other direction and walked toward the exit. What happened to Captain Reeve was not dramatic. The military, at its best, does not traffic in drama when it has discipline available as an alternative. He was not reduced in rank. He was not formally censured. He was reassigned 6 weeks later to a position in logistics planning at a command in the continental United States, a position with fewer operational responsibilities and fewer opportunities to stand at an operations desk during mission-critical windows and form impressions about people he did not know. The reassignment was processed through the normal administrative channels. The paperwork described it in the standard language of operational requirements and career development. Anyone reading it without additional context would not know what it meant. Anyone in the building at Al Udeid on that July night knew exactly what it meant. These things move through a base, the way all such things move. Through the mess hall and the flight line and the corridors where people wait in gray plastic chairs. In the particular economy of telling that military personnel develop when they have all been witnesses to the same event and have all processed it and are now distributing the lesson. You do not need to say everything, to say the important thing. You say enough. The junior officers learned a version of it. Not the version that names names. Not the version that contains all the specific details. The laminated card and the flight hours and the radar tone and the single word in the debrief room. But the version that carries the essential fact, which is that the woman you assumed was the least qualified person in the building was the most qualified person in the building, and that the person who said otherwise was no longer there to say otherwise. This is how it became a story, not by intention, but by repetition. The way useful stories always become stories, because they contain a lesson that people who will face the same situation need to carry, and because the mind holds what the heart has learned better than it holds what it has only been told. Colonel Marsh did not know, or did not attend to the fact, if she did know, that she had become a story. She was not indifferent to her reputation in any careless way. She was simply occupied with the things that had always occupied her. She flew 3 additional missions over the corridor in the following month, under a contract extension that was processed with unusual speed given the operational tempo. On the second of those missions, Torres was in the right seat again, and he was better than the first time, which she noted in the log without elaboration, because elaboration was not what the log required. On the third mission, there was no radar activation and no contact with the fastboat element, and the weather to the north held its position without moving south as it had threatened to do, and it was in every measurable way an uneventful night track, the kind that does not become stories, but that is, in a different kind of accounting, the most important kind, the kind that means the deterrent is working, the kind that means the mission accomplished what the mission was built to accomplish without anyone having to demonstrate anything. She flew it with the same attention and the same settled economy of input that she flew the others. She was not less careful because it was quiet. Quiet, in her experience, was not the same as safe, and safe was not something you confirmed and then stopped working toward. It was something you maintained until you were on the ground and the engines were down and the checklist was complete. She was 56 years old. She had been flying large aircraft over contested water since before some of the people in the squadron had been born. She would fly more missions if the contract was extended and the operational requirement continued. She would fly them with the same care and the same methods and the same notebook with the worn cardboard cover. She would not need anyone to know this. The record knew. The log knew. The straight knew, in whatever way the straight knows things, through the accumulated evidence of aircraft that transited it and returned, of missions completed and fighters fueled and escort tracks satisfied, of the ongoing fact of operations that continued because the people who made them possible continued. That is, in the end, the only thing she had ever needed anyone to know. The recruits who heard the story, the young lieutenants and the new reporting airmen and the officers fresh from their qualification programs who arrived at Al Udeid in the months that followed, heard it in the particular abbreviated form that instructional stories take, when they have been passed through enough hands to be reduced to their essential weight. They heard it as a lesson about assumption. They heard it as a lesson about the way the most dangerous resource in a room does not always announce itself. They heard it as a lesson about what it means to have flown a corridor 47 times and to still be willing to sit in a gray plastic chair in a hallway and wait. The lesson was not about Colonel Marsh specifically. The lesson was about what she represented, which was the thing that the military has always known in theory and has always had to relearn in practice, which is that competence does not declare itself and authority does not require volume, and the person you are most inclined to dismiss may be the person whose judgment you most need before the night is over. Captain Reeve, wherever he was, may have learned this, or he may not. These are the two possibilities that always exist for people who have encountered a truth they were not prepared for. The capacity to absorb the lesson is not guaranteed by the severity of the occasion. Some people meet a Colonel Marsh and are forever changed by it. Some people meet a Colonel Marsh and are merely, quietly, reassigned. The difference between the two is not rank, and it is not aptitude, and it is not even intelligence in the conventional sense. It is something closer to honesty, specifically the honesty that a person brings to the examination of their own assumptions, the willingness to hold up what you think you know against what the evidence is telling you, and to change what you think you know when the evidence requires it. This is, in any profession, the hardest thing. It is harder in the military than in most professions because the military is organized around authority, and authority has a gravitational tendency to bend the evidence toward confirmation, to make the world look like the categories it has already established. The people who resist that tendency are not always the people with the most authority. Sometimes they are the people sitting in the gray plastic chairs. She flew the corridor. She completed the mission. She filed her paperwork and closed her notebook and walked out of the debrief room into a hallway where the consequence of the afternoon was visible through a glass door, and she turned the other way, toward the exit and the night air and the 91-degree cooling that counted, in that latitude, as relief. She did not need the last word. She had the log. 3,214 hours, 47 tracks, 1 corridor, flown in darkness, over black water, while the radar painted the bottom of the wings. That is what the quiet ones carry. Not the argument, not the verdict, the record. And when the record speaks, you do not need to say anything else. If you believe that the measure of a professional is not the noise they make, but the work they do when no one is watching, type the word corridor in the comments. There are more of you down there than you know, and I read every one. For more stories where quiet competence humbles loud arrogance, subscribe to Old Bill's Tales. And if you'd like to help me keep telling them, you'll find my Patreon linked in the description below. Thank you for standing with me.